Hello and welcome to Polity Matters. My name is Jared Nelson. I'm joined by Scott Edberg. Ben is absent, I think taking a tour of Blue Bunny ice cream or something. Today we have a special guest, a fellow member of my presbytery, a former professor at Grove City, and I believe Gordon College before that, Dr. T. David Gordon. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks. Good to be here. It was Gordon Conwell, by the way, not Gordon College.
Oh, okay.
So I was at the seminary for about 14 years before coming to Grove City.
All right. Well, you have some other things that are on your resume too. You've authored some books. I think I first encountered you about 15 years ago. I was at another seminary that was not reformed at Dallas Theological Seminary, but there was a group of us that were reading through Why Johnny Can't Preach, which really helped influence my approach to preaching. Actually got me to read some poetry, so that was a first for me.
Good.
But you've written some other things. You want to tell us a little bit about some of your other books, and you have a new one that you just authored?
Yeah. Uh, I also wrote Why Johnny Can't Sing Hymns, How Pop Culture Rewrote the Hymnal. And both of the Johnny books were, of course, influenced by the original Why Johnny Can't Read, and then
Hmm.
Why Johnny Can't Write. And then the subtitle for each reflected 18 years of teaching media ecology and probably 40 years of reading and studying media ecology. So you'll note the casual reference to Marshall McLuhan in the subtitle to the first, The Media Have Shaped the Messengers. And then in the second one, How Pop Culture Rewrote the Hymnal. Students of musicology um, have argued that the period from 1890 to 1930 was a revolution in music. Um, so, in fact, in Dr. Sweesman's book, he's at the University of Delaware in Wilmington. Um, it's called Selling Sounds, The Commercial Revolution in Music. And a very similar book came out around 2010 by Mark Katz, who was then at UNC and is now at the Peabody Institute at Johns Hopkins Music Institute. He wrote, interestingly, Capturing Sound. And in the same year, Capturing Sound and Selling Sounds came out. And what both argued, and many others, is music was not a commercial commodity until that period, 1890 to 1930. And then the player piano appeared, the gramophone appeared, and later long play records and so forth. But prior to 1890, all music had a human attached. There was no way to mass produce it. And so it was not a commercial product. And so it was a very serious thing. So now everywhere you go, you are forced to listen to um, music that you didn't solicit. And it shapes our musical sensibilities, you see. So when I say how pop culture rewrote the hymnal, what I mean is that we learn music in many ways the way we learn English. A young 10-year-old boy, in France today is speaking French, and a 10-year-old boy in Pittsburgh is speaking something approximating English. And the reason is because they grew up in a culture where they heard the sounds, respectively, of French and English. So also, if people fill up their car with gas at Sheetz and they hear 60s or 70s or 80s pop music. And then they go inside of Sheetz, to purchase a Coca-Cola and they hear it there. And they go to the men's room in Sheetz and they hear it there. Well, it's hard to take music seriously as a serious thing in a culture where when you're pooping or filling the gas in your car, whatever you're doing, you're surrounded by this, what I call crappy music because they play it in the restroom, right? Uh, and so it's hard to believe that music once was defined by the Greek adjective musike, derivative of the muses. They thought it was so sublime that it must have come down to us from the six daughters or seven daughters of Athena. And so to say something was musical is to say it was above ordinary social consequence. And now nothing is less consequential than music. And so it's really altered the whole sociological role and function. So those books were both, sort of media ecologically informed books. My theological education is like anybody else's, an MAR and a THM, and maybe a PhD in biblical studies on top of that. But I don't think I have any real theological insights, but I did have some, I think, media ecological insights. And then in 2019, Promise Law of Faith, Covenant Historical Reasoning in Galatians appeared, in which I argued that Paul's reasoning throughout the letter is covenant historical, not merely redemptive historical. but covenant historical. So he understands the new covenant and its relationship temporally to the Abrahamic covenant and the Sinai covenant. And then I just sent the manuscript of the sequel about a month ago to Hendrickson, and it will come out and it'll be the covenant historical reasoning in Romans. And so those will be the bookends. I did my dissertation under Paul Ochtemeier on Paul's understanding of the law. So it's the only that I've studied seriously as an academic for 40 years is that question. And so that'll be that. But yeah, this April, my little book came out from P&R, must be upstairs somewhere, called uh, Choose Better, Five Biblical Models for Making Ethical Decisions, um, in which I define ethics as not something that's narrow, but something that grows out of anthropology. The human's a decision-making creature. We're a choice-making creature. We're the only form of animate life that really makes consequential choices, and we make hundreds of them daily. And
Hmm.
so to embrace that as part of the image of God, and then to think well about how we go out making decisions is the purpose of the book. And so in the course of 30 or 40 years of studies, I found what I call five models of ethics, a law model, an imitation model, a wisdom model, a warfare model, and a communion model, five different ways of finding wisdom to live well before God. So yeah, I've done some of those kinds of things and done the occasional article in journals, both academic and non-academic.
I have a congregant that's reading
And now what I'm
your
kind of
newest
working
book
on
right
because it
now.
grows out of the oh good. Yeah, I designed it, to be used by lay people. And my hope is that Christian colleges might use it in a freshman course on, Christian life, and especially that Christian and classical education high schools would use it. I certainly hope that it's accessible, to 10th and 11th graders, um,
Hmm.
because, they're going to make a lifetime of choices. And our tradition, is law model dominant, law model heavy. And so our tradition is comfortable saying his, God said, do this or don't do that.
Hmm.
But we're not as comfortable dealing with issues of how we imitate God as his image. We're not as comfortable with the wisdom model of making decisions, it seems to me, and not as comfortable with thinking coram deo and living as a life of communion with God as we are the others.
Yeah.
And I don't think we really believe seriously that there's an invisible warfare going on all around us, and that everything we do either contributes to our health and that of others, or it does the opposite. Um, so if you think about a British football, not American football, on either side of the stadium, you might have Leeds and Manchester United playing against one another, and uh, and they sit on different sides of the field. And they try to drown each other out by singing their songs, right? They all have their kind of their fight song for their team. And you have 15,000 people singing this song, and then 20,000 people on the other side singing theirs back, trying to drown each other out. It's almost like the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Yahweh having their contest out there, you see. Well, I think more silently than British football, there is such a reality going on all around us. There's a warfare contending for the souls and contending against everything that is lovely and everything
Hmm.
that is life sustaining. And every decision we make ought to at least be cognizant of that reality and adjust to it.
Well, along the theme of ethics is actually a document that maybe people have your books on their shelf, but if you're in the PCA and you are an elder, you probably have your document either in their computer or printed off, especially if they've ever had to go through discipline, and that is a procedural checklist for the BCO rules of discipline. And I remember somebody sending this to me early on. This is what you need to know, especially when you come for your BCO exam or if you ever get involved in process. And your name was always on there. And then I came into the Presbytery that you're at, and I was like, hey, I know that guy. I read that book, and then I read that checklist. So I wonder, we wanted to talk to you a little bit about that checklist because it'd be of interest to people who follow us. We're about ready to go through the rules for discipline. Can you tell us a little bit about where did this checklist come from? Was it prompted by something for you to put this thing together? And we'll have a link for it in our show notes too.
Yeah, Thanks for asking that because understanding the genesis of things is a good part of understanding the thing itself. So for the last 9 or 10 years that I was at Gordon Conwell, I taught the course on denominational standards, and it was called Presbyterian and Reformed Denominational Standards. So it was an interdenominational seminary, and yet one requirement for the MDiv is you took a course on your denomination's peculiar standards. Normally, that was a weekend course taught on a Friday night and a Saturday by some local clergyman. The Methodists would send their clergy, mainline Presbyterians send their. But I taught it as a regular full semester, 13-week course. By the way, I still have the bibliography for that. I've added to it some of it. The bibliography is probably 25 pages. And so it was pretty lengthy. And one of my students at the time, Chris Robinson, uh, as his project for that course, decided to put the checklist together to translate the BCAO, which is catch as catch can, mentioning a procedure here and a process there. And I think I was moderating a trial at Presbytery at the time or something. And so Chris decided, ask if that would work for his thesis for the course, for his project for the course. So it was really Chris Robinson who put most of it together. And, I collaborated a little bit and we chatted some, I suppose. And what we were both concerned with is the Book of Church Order is not designed or written in an order that reflects the procedural order.
Yeah.
And so what happens is when people are trying to do their best to do process according to the standards of our Constitution, they actually find it frustrating. Scott, perhaps you have found it frustrating yourself because I think many people do. You're going through there, you're sort of taking you photocopy the whole book of discipline, as it were. Then you go back with with a marker of some sort, and you mark everything that you know needs attention, and then you go back to those and say in what order, which basically means everyone who's ever done discipline in the PCA did what I did. They just didn't publish it, right? That is to say, they all did the same thing Chris and I did. And that's a lot of reinventing of the same wheel. So now we did this back in the late 80s, early 90s. And one of the unfortunate realities is there has been at least one that I know of, and possibly two, changes in judicial process since the checklist was made. So there's at least one lacuna, and there might be two. And I stopped attending General Assembly in the last century. I haven't been in over 25 years. I've been priced out of General Assembly, so I wasn't even in my native Richmond this summer. I grew up there. I was an elder at Stony Point. I was a founding elder at the All Saints there on Grove Avenue. Had lots of friends and relatives, and still didn't go. So unfortunately, by not attending over the last 20 years, whenever there's something that happens that might affect the checklist, I'm not there to notice it. And so someone needs to go back through at some point, and find some hapless student at a seminary somewhere to find what's missing and update the list. And of course, if we weren't in the PCA, if I had done it once, it would have never needed to be redone. But one of the hapless things about our hapless communion is that our Constitution is a moving target that potentially changes every year. And no other communion has ever functioned that way. And arguably, we don't either. We don't function well that way. But you just never know when the Constitution will change. So even people who try to follow it find it exasperating because every 2 to 3 years, the Book of Church Order changes.
So if the ARP has one of these,
just every.
If the ARP has one of these, then it's about 200 years old. Their checklist going through there hasn't changed.
Yeah. What you find is an imperfect constitution that everyone's familiar with works better than a more perfect constitution that no one's familiar with. And so in most communities, maybe every 70 years or so, you consider modifying your constitution because you have found some problems with it. But the alternative is even those of us who believe in constitutional government, we believe it's an important check on our sinful tendencies. So to have a constitution external to Gordon protects the church from Gordon's impulses and his stupidity and so forth. So it's good to have a constitution, and I tried to follow it. But the problem is ours changes so often, it frustrates those of us who try to follow it.
Yeah, that's kind
So,
of connected to we have probably the most thorough rules of discipline of NAPARC. And the more details that you add to the rules of discipline, the more subject to scrutiny they are, and the more then they need to theoretically be changed to make them better. And so I was looking at the OPC's rules of discipline, and I'm like, wow, this is so simple. Ours are
Yeah.
like almost there's so many guardrails and it's still confusing, even with the more guardrails than other traditions.
Yeah.
yeah.
And I don't know if the two of you have observed this or not, but remember, Constitution is what constitutes us. Isn't that interesting? That's what the word means. And so what happens is our Constitution also, in some sense, disciplines us and shapes us. And unfortunately, in the case of our Constitution, um, it makes us think that there's a procedural solution to every problem.
Mm,
And that's not
Mm.
true, right? There's no procedural solution to Adamic sin. If so, we would have all followed that solution years ago. But there isn't one, right? It's only the grace of God that deals with it. So I've noticed even in our little presbytery, and we now have an entire chapter on this on the standing rules. The new chapter 7-2 that mentions 6 different things that can and should be and must be done whenever a discipline matter comes before the stated clerk. And I'm thinking, well, what did he do before that? Well, he just exercised his judgment and probably consulted the chairman of the ARC. And if he thought it was significant, asked the chairman of the ARC to call him an ad hoc meeting of the ARC to advise the stated clerk. Now we have a 2-page document that we did not follow correctly 2 weeks ago at our presbytery. And I'm on the subcommittee studying it right now, and I'm arguing to give it right back to the presbytery because it didn't tell us which of the 6 things we're supposed to do. And since we don't know which of the 6 things we're supposed to do, I argue that we should give it back to them and let them realize that this new fancy multiple procedure thing is not working very well because the first time we tried it, it didn't, right?
Yeah.
So
Well,
one of the unfortunate things in the PCA is we keep adding, don't we, Scott? We keep adding amendments to the book, thinking there has to be a procedural solution here. And there's no substitute for just Christian compassion and common sense.
so imagine then somebody who is coming into a PCA church. He's a new teaching elder, maybe in his first couple of years, and he's looking at this, and this is kind of overwhelming to him how much is in the rules of discipline. And he comes across your checklist, and he's realizing there's something that's going to come up in his church that's going to require process of some sort. How does he use this checklist? How does he approach it? Does he just kind of pick it up and just start going through and then make his way through the 15 pages, or what would you suggest he does as he's approaching needing to do process?
Yeah, I think that he should make a photocopy of it, and then he should treat it the way Mortimer Adler tells us to treat a book, which is to make marginalia. And so I think that as he looks at the checklist, the first thing he should do is go down the list and say, are all these things already clear to me? Right? And if not, put a question mark in the margin because they will normally have a BCO reference. And then once he's gone through the list and says, let's say there's 12 things, and he says, 9 or 10 of them I'm pretty sure I'm familiar with, but there's 2 or 3 that I'm not at all confident they even understand. Then he can go back and actually read the pertinent passages there to be sure that he understands more than the mere skeleton of a checklist, what the substance of each of those is. And then if he really has the time and inclination to do it, I think he should probably do what I recommend people do with Robert's rules too, and that is to realize that for all of the picayune nature of Robert's rules, it's basically just 2 broad principles: to be fair and to be efficient. And you can explain every single passage in Robert's rules as either designed for fairness or for efficiency. And if you go back through the Book of Church Order and the Book of Discipline and ask why are there so many processes, is this designed to make it fair? Is this designed to make it efficient? You'll find a similar thing works there. And it really helps once you understand the wisdom behind the original framers, because this goes back to the second book of discipline, I'm sure. Much of it goes all the way back to the Scottish second book. You can be sure there were very good reasons for the various things that were there, especially the broader ones. Um, And in fact, many of them you could satisfy through natural law. If you look at the Bill of Rights, the original 10 amendments to the Constitution, about five or six of them are what you and I would regard as picayune matters of judicial process. A right to have an indictment, to confront your accuser, to offer your own rebuttal, um, no undue search and seizure, and so forth. So even by the light of human nature in the constitution of the human as a human being, the founding fathers understood that, in procedural justice, we will not always in this earth attain true justice. We await the return of Christ for true justice, but we can and must insist on procedural justice. A person who has been tried and found guilty may disagree with the finding, but he ought to be able to look the people now and say, you treated me fairly. You followed your own rules. I was prepared to follow these rules. You did follow them. I was treated fairly. I got procedural justice. In my opinion, I didn't get actual justice, but I did get procedural justice. And so it's not nothing to get procedural justice. David Coffin taught me this years ago. He really helped me to see that procedural justice is a wonderful expression of the law of charity, to do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And then when you see it that way, it's not just an external checklist of some sort that you have to follow, but you understand it's designed to treat people who are parties to a case of process the way you would like to be treated, the way you would like your loved ones to be treated if they had a case of process.
Yeah, and not only the BCO and the Bill of Rights, but Matthew 18 has something of a process that you start with, to go to them, to confront them, to bring a witness, and then at some point to tell it to the church. And so I think I'll let Scott ask some questions of, once you get to that, tell it to the church part of it, some
Yeah.
detailed questions. So I'll hand it over to Scott there.
Yeah, perhaps a good place to start when thinking about the checklist and just general process in the PCA, or what are some of the common errors that you've seen in your ministry made by courts of the church when pursuing process?
I think the most common one um, is uh, pursuing process prematurely. Um, I used to teach courses on elder training, not only in my own church, but in some churches in New Hampshire and New England. When new churches were planted, and Presbytery would appoint people to educate the initial elders. And of course, we covered the Westminster Standards and we covered the Constitution. But then in my last session with them, I always covered a few practical matters. And the very last thing I said every time was, if you or anyone else on the session or the presbytery says, well, we have to do something, lock him up and don't let him out until he gets over it.
Hmm.
Because when people feel frustrated and are unsure, that's exactly when they should not act, right? But there's something in us as humans that when we feel frustrated and unsure, we do act. And that's the worst time to act. And so I think the most frequent problem I've seen is people resorting to formal process before they've exhausted the informal process. That's the most common failure. So, for instance, if you think about Matthew 18, since Jared just mentioned that, what's interesting about Matthew 18 is there are certain repetitions as you go through that, and if you go do this and tell it to this, especially the statement, and tell it to them and tell it to them and so forth. But notice that the parallelism is not complete, and it could be just for the sake of efficiency. But I think it's more than that. Note then, in the first phase, when you go to a brother alone, monon, it says, and if he listens, you have gained a brother. But in the second and third phases, it doesn't say, if he listens, you've gained a brother. It says, if he does not listen. And that's because people who do not have the grace of God to resolve their matters privately are not going to find the matter resolved by public process. So your last chance to actually be reconciled to a brother is when you go to him privately. And that, if it means 10 meetings with him privately, you do that for as long as you possibly can. And once you jump to formal process, I think the implicit teaching there of Matthew 18 is, at that point, we don't even envision that you're going to win a brother. You're just going to have justice established, but you're not going to reconcile. brothers once you have formal process. And I don't think I've seen formal process unite people more than twice in my entire lifetime. In 40 years of being an elder or a pastor, um, I don't think I've seen it more than twice. I do recall it once at Stony Point. A woman had been excommunicated because she had an adulterous affair, and she later moved, I believe, from Richmond to Atlanta. And like eight, and the elders prayed for her for 8 years, you know. And at some point, they got a phone call, and she was moving back to Richmond, and they said, "Have you changed jobs?" And she said, "No, I need to be reconciled to God and to this church. I need to come back to Stony Point and repent of my sin and ask to be received back into membership of the church," which was a mind blower, right?
Mhm.
But it's also a mind blower because it happens so rarely. So I know
Even though
many
that's
times,
the highest goal of discipline. To
yes, right. That's your goal. And so if Matthew 18 is right, of course it's right. The thing to do is to exhaust what can be done at the informal stage before we go to the formal stage, because the formal stage so rarely works. Now, when I say rarely works, it rarely works at reconciling the parties. If someone really has wronged someone else, then justice requires a public accounting of that. And so, yes, justice can be satisfied, but the relationship will not be healed by formal process, almost never. It just doesn't do it. So that's the most frequent one, Scott. The most frequent one I've seen is people wanting to move to judicial process quickly, like the motion at our presbytery last 2 weeks ago, right? We did not answer 34.5. I stood and raised it about does it strike at the vitals of religion and is spread industriously. We didn't ask the person involved or his elder whether this was spread industriously, or was the MR committee the only person he'd ever told us to, right? So we didn't satisfy that minimal because bang, we had a process before us. We were going right through to the process of Standing Rule 7-2 and ready to go to process. And I'm going to throw it right back at Presbytery if I have anything to do with it. We'll come right back to the next meeting and say, we're not, no, sir, brothers, you told us to do this and we didn't do it. We're not going to do it. And if you want someone else to do it, get another committee to do it because we are not going to do it, right? Because there are people in our presbytery who think the first thing to do whenever there's a problem is to institute process. And I think it's the last thing you should do.
And so when does process start? Does that start at the moment of a judicial commission with an investigative committee? How would you see the distinctions between those two?
Yeah, I'm not sure that we should have investigative committees because I don't read 31.2 the way the PCA reads 31.2. So I'd say, by the way, the reason is if you look at the 1933 book,
Mhm.
the 1933 book does not have a paragraph break in there. And it says that that a person might, to clear his name, request an investigation. And then the next sentence is if such investigation, however proceeding, leads to a strong presumption of guilt. In the original 1933 book, that's all within one paragraph. And the such investigation refers to the previous sentence and the use of the word investigation there. But if you make it a separate paragraph, which the PCA did, I think just by typographical error, I don't think they were thinking about it. Now the such investigation could refer to the entirety of that first paragraph, including the regular inspection we have over people under our care and so forth. So you routinely run into people saying, I think we should have a 31.2 investigation. And I say there is no such thing as a 31.2 investigation unless the person who feels aggrieved by things requests such an investigation. And that's what such investigation means in the next sentence. And you can look at it in the 1933 book. There is no break there. It's all one paragraph. PCA inserts a double space and makes a new paragraph so that such refers to the entire paragraph, not to the previous sentence. And so wittingly or unwittingly, it altered what the thing said. So to answer your question, yeah, I don't think process begins until some court of the church appoints some agent or assumes to itself agency in the matter and orders that an indictment be drawn up and a prosecutor be appointed.
Fast forwarding then perhaps a little, I appreciated your checklist when the church I served had to deal with some of a case of process. But when we got to the trial, I remember thinking the checklist is good, but how does this look in reality, if that makes sense? What does a trial actually look like? Could you perhaps comment on what a trial, the day of a trial looks like in a church court?
Maybe a little bit. I know that, for instance, using the checklist or using one's own checklist, one of the problems that there are certain things that have to be done. And in our presbytery, it has been our custom to do those things and nothing else. And I don't think fulfilling the checklist means that's all that you can do. So, for instance, in our presbytery, the people who are on the floor are not given an opportunity to ask questions, either of the accused and or the accused counsel or the prosecutor. Um, and and so we've had cases where I abstained because the question that I thought was the obvious question that the prosecutor should have asked, he didn't ask. And so the question that I think sort of solved the matter just like that was never asked, and there was no occasion for anyone to ask it. So I would say that in addition to the checklist, if a person just raises his hand and seeks the floor from the moderator and says, Mr. Moderator, may those of us who are present also ask questions. Not argue, not, the time of deliberation is late. I understand that. But I think everyone present should be able to ask questions which they need to have answered. So we had a dispute, 7 or 8 years ago in a case in our presbytery, where the accused and the accuser disagreed over whether they had met to discuss a certain matter, right? Neither was present when the other was questioned. And the accuser was asked, did you meet with so-and-so about this? And he said, I tried to, and he refused. And then the accused was never asked, did you refuse to meet with this guy? Instead, he said, oh, we met many times, right? I would have said, when and where? I don't mean the exact date and time, but was it at McDonald's roughly last March? Or was it, at Popeyes last April? And then we go back and ask the other one. He says he did meet with you at Popeyes in April or McDonald's in March, right? And you could get to the heart of the matter. But in this case, we never understood whether the accuser was right and the accused was wrong because we never had a chance to cross-examine. So I think the checklist is the minimum that we have to do, that the Constitution requires us to do. But I think any presbytery, in its own judgment, if it thinks it needs to raise more questions or even to re-examine certain witnesses, it should have the right to do so. Otherwise, it comes down to two people being on their A game every time, right? The prosecutor has to be on his A game, and the defense attorney has to be on his A game. And if either one of them isn't, now we decide a thing because one of them wasn't on his A game. And that's not the right way to do it. So you have to follow the rules, yes, but you shouldn't feel limited to following the rules. You should also do things that contribute to justice.
What are some proactive measures that pastors can take to make sure that everyone's rights are protected?
Well, you make sure that they have a copy of the pertinent parts of the Book of Church Order, that they understand the Constitution, that they don't run into it for the first time, when they're on the accused end of it, as it were. And you try to help them see how those processes are designed to protect them. And then you offer to be their counsel and advocate. I've offered to be advocate for people that I thought were guilty. And I don't mind doing that. The point would be you make the best case you can. And in fact, I've had cases in the presbytery where I volunteered to be either the prosecutor or the defense counsel and let the committee decide which one. Because to me, it's an administrative matter and it should be done as an administrative matter. It's a clerical matter where you make sure that you put before the court the pertinent things. It's not like you see it on television. In fact, real court is not like what you see on television, and the church courts aren't either. It should be just a perfectly straightforward thing that anyone could do. We should be able to draw names from a hat from presbytery and say, okay, Nelson, you're going to be the prosecutor. Gordon, you're going to be defense, right? Any of us should be able to do that when called upon to do so. And if everyone was called on to do so that way, we would all get better at it too. By the way, one of the European nations used to have a similar thing. One of the European nations, attorneys were not privately employed by law firms. They were employed by the state. And a judge would appoint a prosecutor and a defense attorney. And you might spend half of your career defending and half of your career prosecuting. No one could buy a better lawyer. OJ couldn't buy a better lawyer in such a nation because the court was going to appoint the lawyer for them. And so the reason some nations did that is to avoid and evade what's obviously the case in the United States, that if you don't have money, you're going to be in jail for 30 days awaiting arraignment or trial. And if you do have money, you're out on bail. And if you have money, you're probably going to have good defense. And if you don't have money, you're going to have poor court-ordered defense. And so, yeah, you buy and sell justice in the United States.
Dialing back perhaps to thinking about the origin of accusations, when someone has an offense against another believer, whether it be a pastor or likewise, how should that unfold? I know that you mentioned perhaps your own disagreement in 31.2 and 31.1 in the BCO with its original draft. But when someone has a grievance or issue that they feel like they've exhausted all their options, how should that be submitted to the court? What should that look like?
There's one small step in between, and that is that you look at 1 Corinthians 7 and say, is it a small, comparatively insignificant matter? Paul, I think, is translated trivial or trifling in most translations, right? So, and Paul says in some cases it's probably better to suffer wrong. So everyone should consider when they've been wronged, whether it's the kind of thing that they should just let go. And then if they say, I don't, for a variety of reasons, I don't think I can let it go. It might touch upon the person's professional hireability and this kind of a thing. Then if a person finds that it's not trifling, but it's very serious, then I think probably at a minimum what he does at that point is he contacts the other person one more time and says, I'd like you to do me a favor. I'd like you to talk me out of what I'm about to do, because what I'm about to do is to institute formal process against you. And so we haven't been able to resolve this before. And so I feel that I'm now obliged to seek formal redress of my grievance, but I'd like to be talked out of it. And I'd like to give you one more chance to be reconciled to me and me to you so that we don't have to proceed there. To my knowledge, no one has ever done that in the history of the world since Adam, right? But to me, it makes perfectly eminent sense that everyone ought to do it, right? That we ought to make that final stab at reconciliation before formal process. Yeah, and then after that, of course, we try to find someone with a little bit more experience than ourselves to make sure that we make our formal process in an appropriate, constitutionally valid way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. As a clerk of a presbytery, I sometimes receive 31.2 kind of Christian character reports that are like just like a scatter shot of a shotgun, where it's like every single little grievance that was ever perpetrated is included in their accusation. And it's sometimes difficult for the presbytery to handle such a wide shot because some of them might actually rise to the occasion of judicial process, while others are petty. You know, they're not, they're very small. You looked at me the wrong way kind of things. And so sometimes it's hard to separate those as you just get like almost a regurgitation of everything that's ever been wrong.
Yeah, that's right. And if you give counsel to people, and if they ask your counsel at a time like that, you can say, well, if you want to lose your case, leave it in the form that it currently is, then you're guaranteed to lose. Because the notion that 100 bad arguments is better than one good argument won't fly in court. It's just the opposite. The person who alleges that the pastor has wronged them, let's say 20 times because was curt with them one day when they ask a question or whatever it is, what will happen is, human nature being human nature, people will say, well, they're just throwing stuff at him until something sticks. Yeah. So it's also ill-advised. What you really boil it down to is there one thing or two things that I feel aggrieved by, and make the grievance as clear as you can. It's also easier on the court to adjudicate that.
Yes.
But the problem is, the way that the boy in Pittsburgh speaks something approximating English. The problem is what most people know about judicial process they've learned from television. Mm-hmm. And so what makes good drama, an interesting television program, doesn't make good law or good process. And so people mislearn many things about the judicial process that they bring with them unwittingly into this arena.
That kind of gets me thinking about how the PCA has been internally debating overhauling our rules of discipline. Um, Perhaps could you help us distinguish between then like a civil trial from an ecclesiastical trial with its jurisdictions? Because it seems that some are talking about almost conflating our ecclesiastical court system with the civil almost and merging them in some capacity just by how they're ran. And so, could you perhaps talk about the distinction between the two and their roles in society?
Yeah, their distinctions probably go back uh, to their distinctions of the nature of the powers that God has given to them. So, for instance, the state, um, when it subpoenas you, they can find you in contempt of court if you do not attend the trial. And we really have no provision for that and probably shouldn't. Uh, but we certainly can't fine people, right? We can't jail them, right? But they can, especially grand juries. Grand juries are completely illegal. I mean, they're utterly illegal. We shouldn't have them. They're contrary to the Constitution from the beginning to the end almost, because they're basically ways of conducting a pre-trial without any of the protections that would be required by law in a real trial. And yet they determine what goes to trial. And so they're very influential in our system of government and they're highly irregular. But that's one of the big differences is that the state has the power to subpoena witnesses. We can invite them. We can say, the Presbytery of the Ascension wishes you to be present on this date. But I doubt we could do anything if people refuse to show up. The other is that the state doesn't make the distinction we make between believers and unbelievers, which I think came up at a recent General Assembly, didn't it?
Hmm.
There were those who wanted to say we want pagans to run our church courts, um, and which strikes me as not a great idea. Uh, that I think the sons of light and the sons of darkness have a few differences here and there, and that would be one of them. But yeah, in fact, the book even requires that they have to believe in an eternal state of reward and punishment, right?
Mhm.
They have to realize there are real consequences to this. And one of the consequences mentioned of the Book of Church Order that I don't recall occurring, but it ought to have occurred many times, um, is that in the section on voluntary prosecution, 31.3, 31.6, 31.9, in that section, 31.9 warns that if a person presents himself as a voluntary prosecutor and does not prove the case, he may himself be censured as an accuser of the brethren, right?
Mhm.
And yet, I don't know personally of an experience where a person who brought to trial a matter that failed was ever disciplined for it. But in the Mosaic Law, especially if it was a capital crime, if you bore false witness in a capital crime, they put you to death. I mean, that'll keep you honest, right? So theirs was basically, if it's 20 years in prison and you bear false witness, you get the 20 years in prison. If it's a capital crime, you bear false witness, you get killed. And so, whether there's skin in the game or not, you see, is an important part of the way our book looks at it. And so, if people don't believe in God or in an eternal state of reward and punishment, what skin do they have in the game? There's really no motivation for them to speak the truth because, unlike in the civil courts, they can't be found in contempt of court. They can't be found guilty of perjury and so forth. So, there's really no other good motive for them to speak truthfully in our courts, other than that the fear of God, as it were. That if you don't believe in God, how can you fear Him?
Looking at the infliction of like what it is that you do if you get to say a guilty verdict, you have these different church censors because we are ministerial and declarative. We don't have the power of the sword, so we can't lock them up.
Mhm.
I think within the church that would just be like putting you on nursery committee duty or something like that, right? Um, but there's these different things you can do. Admonition, there's a suspension from the sacraments, and there's excommunication. And then if you're an officer, there's deposition or suspension from office. I have noticed the times in which I've been involved with something, whether it was a case with process or without. This seems to be the hardest one to figure out. What goes into what bucket of, is this an admonition thing? Is this a suspension from the table? How do we navigate when we get to the end of a process? what's the appropriate thing um, to find for a church censor?
Well, there's a little bit of advice, in the book itself, in the chapter on censures. So, for instance, if a matter is not widely known, it's privately known, let's say a dispute between two or three parties and so forth, and the guilty party declares his sorrow for what he's done, there's really no need to do anything more than admonition. That's the church's way, the church court's way of saying a wrongdoing was done. It was admittedly a wrongdoing, and we admonished the person because we wanted to encourage his repentance. Uh, and then I think the book says that if it's generally known, if it's a more public matter and so forth, then the public is in some sense demanding the church recognize the severity of the issue. And so there are times when even if the accused is found guilty and expresses penitence, there's still occasions in which the severity of the offense requires at least a temporary suspension of some sort, either from the sacrament or from office, because it satisfies the proportionality of justice, that there are smaller offenses and greater offenses. And the standards even say that, right? That they're not equally heinous. There are things that aggravate offenses and make some more heinous than others. So I think the public expects that we proceed through degrees of censure, and that's why we have them. We don't do it well. I guess it's the good news is we don't do many judicial cases, and the bad news is we don't do many judicial cases, so we don't learn to do it well. And so we had a case a few years ago where there was an honest difference of opinion as to what the ninth commandment required. And so the individual who presented himself as his own accuser on two grounds, one other ground, and the ninth commandment. He later stood in front of the whole presbytery and read through what are the sins in the ninth commandment. He read the whole list out loud and said, I didn't do any of this, right? And then we moved to a higher degree of censure than the original admonition just because he had an honest difference of opinion with us. Now, I thought it was utterly wrong for us to have done that. We should have just left it. There was no need for us to do anything at that point. We'd already admonished him for two grounds that he had himself acknowledged, and now he was just informing us that had he to do it all over again, he would withdraw that second ground. But that doesn't do the admonition that was already delivered. And so we had already declared ourselves as a court of the church that we thought what he did violated the ninth commandment, and we admonished him for it. And now if he doesn't think so, okay, that's a difference of opinion, but we don't have to go any farther. And we ended up driving that good brother out of the PCA entirely, right? He's gone, right? He probably hadn't had lunch with anyone in our presbytery since then. And he was already a retired man at the time. So how did we protect the flock from an abusive pastor when he wasn't even a pastor anymore?
Well, I wonder too, with the whole process, what does submission to the brethren look like then at the end of that process? Because there's the possibility of appeal or complaint, depending on where you're at in that process and what party you are. But what does it look like to submit to the brethren in process?
Yeah, I think it's the opposite, isn't it, from contumacy? So contumacy is on one side of the seesaw and submission is on the other. Then in both, it is the question of whether you cooperate with the process. Submission does not mean you surrender your conscience. Submission does not mean that if you believe X is a sin, that you have to now believe that it isn't a sin and vice versa. So submission to the brothers does not mean that we concur with their judgment. It means we submit to their administration. So we attend the trial, we offer testimony, we answer the questions they ask us to answer, and so forth. But it does not require violating the doctrine of conscience, which is interesting because the doctrine of conscience appears not only in the chapter on that, on Christian liberty, but it appears implicitly in chapter 1 on Scripture. So the idea that God alone is Lord of the conscience pops up several places in the standards, and it seems to have been a very central doctrine that animated the Reformation. Certainly animated Luther, didn't it? And so submission to the brothers does not mean that one agrees with them. It means one submits to the processes to which one submits when he joins the church and submits to the government and discipline of the church. And very similar for office holders, they do a similar thing.
Yeah, I've learned, I've had to do a decent amount of study just because of my own Presbyterianism issues. And what I've learned is that censures are sentencing, and after the trial is done, the censure is the sentence. And the
Mhm.
person who is found guilty sits under that censure until they repent. And there's no escalating the censure because he won't repent of what he's been found guilty of, that he just lives in that sentence. And so it's not contumacy because he hasn't said everything that you want him to say. And it's not
Correct.
failing to submit just because he disagrees. And so there's been a lot of back and forth between my Presbyterian and the SJC trying to figure out how to move forward with our current problem. And a part of that is thinking that, well, if he doesn't, he's not submitting to us unless he does X, Y, and Z, but we're already way past that, right? That was like 3, 4 years ago. There is no process or trial currently against him. This is looking back and trying to do more, even though if you wanted to do more, you failed when you sentenced him. You may have missentenced him, right? You might have done something more if you'd have known the weight of a sentence, but there's no escalating because he hasn't said what you wanted him to say.
Correct. Yeah, I think that's right. The only exception would be if there's an indefinite suspension, where it's not a definite suspension for a definite period of time, but an indefinite suspension. There might be certain conditions that would cause the church to then remove the indefinite suspension.
Yeah.
And they could make, I think, legitimate requests, that the person church attend church every week, or that if they're having marital troubles, that they once or twice a month go to marital counseling and this kind of a thing. So,
Hmm.
and then when the person submits both to the censure, but into the recommended source of relief, um, then they could say at some point, yeah, we think that we can lift the censure at this point.
Yeah.
So we can't be exhaustive in everything and going through the list, but this is kind of meant to be a introduction for people that as we're going to start going through chapter by chapter and looking at some commentaries and exploring that together. But if somebody finds this, they're going to begin process on some sort of a matter. They're using the checklist. Um, maybe not just procedurally. You can ask your clerk, of course. You can ask other people around to get some advice on that. But would you have any spiritual advice to somebody doing that? I just think of Newton writing his famous letter to somebody who was about to engage in controversy and said something along the lines of, "This may be important, but it's also dangerous to the soul." Um, would you have any kind of advice spiritually or keeping your sanctification throughout the process yourself to somebody who's about to begin process? What should they be on guard for themselves about?
Well, I think that it's very wise to do some reflection on Galatians 6:1 under those kinds of circumstances. Um, and it's very interesting where lest you yourself become caught up, and you can get caught up in two ways. If you're too sympathetic to the accused, you might develop sympathy for what he's been accused of and be more inclined to commit that sin yourself in the future. There's also the possibility, and the commentators mentioned this as a second possibility, which is that you become judgmental and you start to think of yourself as better than the accused. Um, and so there you can become puffed up. I mean, we saw this recently when a reasonably prominent preacher in the United States left the ministry. And as you could imagine, within 3 or 4 days on the internet, everyone speculated as to what was wrong with this individual that led to this. And I remember thinking, what was wrong with him is the same thing wrong with me. He has original sin. That's what's wrong with him. And there isn't a pill that we can take. And so whether he followed the grammar rule or didn't, whether he did this or didn't, whether right, the simple fact of the matter is, as sinners, we could break all 10 commandments tomorrow. Any day of the week we could. And apart from the restraining grace of common grace or the restraining grace of special grace, we could. So I think there's the double temptation to avoid there in Galatians 6. It's warning us on the one hand, in our sympathy for the accused, not to develop sympathy for the behavior that is accused. and think of it too lightly, because then we will welcome it into our own soul and we'll start
Mhm.
contemplating those kinds of things. And the other is, I think, to become puffed up and to think that we're above all that and this would never happen to us. So I think a good amount of reflecting on that would be wise. I think maybe in the 2 or 3 week process of the entire thing, it wouldn't hurt for people involved in it to reflect on that passage every morning. Just to say, I would add to my normal devotional practice some reflection and meditation on Galatians 6, and just reflect on that again and again and again, and to avoid, on the one hand, over sympathizing with the behavior accused, and then on the other hand, being judgmental as though we are above that and this would never happen to me. Because it's just dangerous for our soul either way. And very clever of Paul to realize it too. In a remarkable short frame of time, he covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, do either of you have any final thoughts as we seek to wrap this up? All right. Well, I'll let Ben put a little ending onto this episode. But Dr. Gordon, thank you so much for your time and attention on this. This has been a really helpful document, I know, to a lot of people, and hopefully some people find it helpful to think through it on a podcast too. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Good to be with you guys.
As the tour guide at the Blue Bunny plant said surprisingly several times, this podcast is over. Thank you for joining us. If you're interested in learning anything more about what we have talked about, check out the show notes in your podcast player or at politymatters.org. If you enjoyed the show, consider following us on Twitter or Facebook at Polity Matters, and be sure to subscribe in your podcast app of choice. Share episodes with friends. Let people know that we're about to start working our way through the BCO rules of discipline. Big thanks to Dr. T. David Gordon for joining the guys for this interview on that very valuable resource. If you have questions or comments, listeners, you can reach out to us at politymattersfeedback@gmail.com. There's also a link below to support our work that gets you not just supporting the production of the show, but there's some added value in there as well. Be sure to check that out and consider helping us out. Until next time, we thank you for spending time with us. Y'all take care.